how fortunate I've been to go places and see places, whether it's here in the United States, and some of you guys have gone and things like that. I was thinking about Bob and Angie. They went on a trip not too long ago, a couple of years ago. You guys took a long trip across the country and see all kinds of things. And that's just so cool. And you say, what's this got to do with God and his presence? Well, I was thinking about that, and then I came across this verse. If you have your Bibles, I just want to start off by going to Psalm 84, just a couple verses. And these may sound pretty familiar because you see these verses popping up in some modern praise and worship songs. In the last 20, 30 years, they've popped up. Psalm 84, I'm going to read, and we don't have time, for time's sake, because we got a lot to go through today. I'm not going to go read the whole psalm, but I'm going to hit 2 or 3 verses here. But in Psalm 84, verse 1, These are some of the worship people, leaders in Israel have written this psalm. This isn't a psalm of David. And they wrote this. How lovely, speaking of God, they're praising God, how lovely is your dwelling place, Lord Almighty. Verse 2, my soul yearns, even it faints. That's how emotionally attached they are. My soul yearns, even faints for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh cry out for the living God. And then skip down to verse 10, just the beginning of verse 10. This is the really familiar one. Better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. Wow. And I sat there and I read that and thinking about what I just told you about, all these places I've been to and beaches I've sat on and mountains I've seen that are just, I've been on, I've never climbed it because that's way beyond me, but I went quite a ways up on Mount Kilimanjaro, which is the highest peak on the African plain, on the African continent. And then I've been at the base of Mount Kenya, which is the second highest, and these are snow-covered glacier places that are thousands and thousands of feet above sea level, and it's just amazing to me. I've seen amazing animals and sights and all these things, and I've been blessed to go to these places where I've been able to relax and meditate on God. I've seen the sunrise on the Serengeti Plain, talked about that, and it's just amazing. I get what the psalmist meant when he talks about the heavens declare the glory of God and how he praises God for the creation that he's got going on there. And yet, when I come to this verse, and he says, better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere, my mind, if I'm going to be honest, I'm sitting back going, really? Better is one day in the presence of God than 1,000 days on a Hawaiian beach. Better. And put whatever your blank is for your greatest spot that you've ever been to or want to go to. Maybe you've seen some of those nice places in Tahiti or whatever, and you're like, oh, that would be the greatest place. Or maybe you're a Alaskan cruise kind of person or whatever. But what the psalmist is writing here, he says, better is one day in the presence of God than 1,000 days of this. We've talked about this before. 1,000 days, not one day, but 1,000 days. And that blows my mind that they thought that, because this is a theme that runs throughout the whole Word of God. And what I understand is that the ancient writers of these scriptures, they knew something that maybe we've forgotten along the way. They believed, and when I say they believed, they didn't just like, oh yeah, I believe it. No, they lived this truth. They believed that the presence of God is better than the best, and you can fill in the blank. Wow. And I can tell you, we don't. Just look around at all the empty seats. I know this is going to be a tough one here, but it's true. Because, man, this is the last place we want to be in the presence of God. We'd rather be out vacationing. We'd rather be out on the beach. Most of the time, that's the way we feel. And it's okay to vacation. God understands when you need to take some time to get your sanity back. I'm not trying to condemn that. What I'm saying is we spend more time away from God than for God. That's why Sunday night we have 20 people that come. And it's not just our church, it's every church. That's why religion's failing right now. Do you realize that's the problem, that we don't value God because we don't believe what they just said here? And it begs me to answer this question that I've always thought but never been able to articulate, because you're not supposed to ask questions like this in church, which is a sad thing about churches, because churches really haven't wanted you to ask questions that sort of make it tough for them to answer. But the question I have that I want you to think about now, Before you answer this in your mind with a simple yes or no, don't. In fact, don't even answer it. Just think about the question. Because most of us have been programmed through the flannel graph Jesus stories in our Sunday school classes to answer it quickly, but we're not honest when we answer it. And there again, this is a tough one today because I want to point this out. This is our problem. But the question I have is, can a person like you, can a person like me, and I'm not talking about the person that you're showing everybody, I'm talking about the real person side. Can a person like you, can a person like me be in the place where God is? Now, I want you to think about that one because, we can sit back and go, yeah, I'm saved, all that kind of stuff. I'm a church member, all that, and we can give the Sunday school answer of yes, but let's really think about it. In fact, let's look into what God's Word has to say about it because that's a subject that and you say, well, wait a minute, haven't you for the last 8 weeks been telling us that, we should be living in the presence of God? Yeah, I have, but we're taking a little bit back turn because I think we may have overlooked some things in this thinking that we haven't dealt with in our lives. And this is a very serious subject today because the question, once again, is can a person like you, a person like me, be in the place where God is? That's a tough one. In other words, what I'm asking you is the glorious, holy, wonderful God here with you or over there with them? And I know we talked about this briefly at the beginning of our series, but really the truth of the matter is that's a tougher question than we may give credit for. I think the problem is, and this is the obvious question, the obvious statement for those that have been in church for any length of time, the obvious truth is sin turns here into there. Think about it. Imagine this. You're standing in a room, maybe your house or whatever. You're sitting in there, and all of a sudden you hear a loud voice from outside, and you sort of like, I got to know what's going on because this is really loud. And you look through your window, whether it's your office or wherever you're at, you look through the window and you see this lady, young lady, she's standing outside on a sidewalk, standing there very still, very quiet, while a man starts walking towards her. His face is red, his mouth is open, and you can hear words, but you don't understand because you're not out there with him, but you just hear noise. He's loud, he's obnoxious, he's yelling, and you can tell there's something not right. Don't know what it is? And really, you're probably sitting back going, I don't care as long as he doesn't do anything stupid to this lady, because that's not right. But you can't help but notice what's going on. As he approaches, he just gets more animated, more loud. He's flailing his arms, not in fists, but he's flailing them in frustration. His voice is so animated and yelling. And her head is just down. She's quiet. And all you see is her turn her back to him as he continues to scream and yell. And it's just bothering you. And you don't know what it's all about, but you're intrigued because you don't know this is not normal behavior that you see all the time, but you probably have seen something similar to that somewhere along the line. You may have even been part of it. And you see the young lady, as this man's walking with very hard steps, yelling and flailing, she begins to walk, but not to him. She begins to walk away, slowly, steady, not saying a word, just walking away. He quickens his pace because there was quite a distance between them to make sure that he can get his words in and make sure she hears them. She doesn't change her pace. She just keeps walking. And as you sit there and stare out the window looking at this couple, not knowing are they married, are they just dating, are they friends, are they enemies, do they even know each other, what in the world's going on, you are frustrated for her safety, but you realize he's not really going to attack her physically. He's just verbally abusing her. And she just keeps walking, never stopping, never turning, never saying a word. Until finally she disappears out of your sight. And he has closed most of the distance, and he's still yelling even as she's gone away. And he finally yells his last couple of things, which you're not really sure exactly what he says. And he turns around, face still red with anger and his upset look, and he walks away. We've all seen something like that. Some of us have even experienced something like that. Frustration. And what we know here is that sin in its basis, for most of us, is a separator. Sin's a separator. So you don't have to know anything about that couple other than there's something wrong in that relationship, whether they're even intimate or not. There's a relationship problem where he's yelling at her and she walked away. But notice she couldn't stand there with him because sin separates us, doesn't it? And we've all experienced that to some point in our lives. See, whenever we replace love with sin, it separates us in our relationships. And that's important to understand that. That's what the Bible really teaches. And it doesn't just teach it about people, but it teaches us about our relationship with God. See, whenever we take and we replace sin, our love with sin, it separates. Because sin is the great maul that really breaks apart the unity of God's people. It really is. It's been doing that since the Garden of Eden. It really has. Think about Cain and Abel. Man, two brothers, and I know sometimes brothers don't always get along, but you're talking about there's two brothers that one murdered the other one. Over what? Over fruit and lambs. That's crazy when you think about it. See, sin breaks apart the unity of God's people, and that's the problem. But as I said, also, sin doesn't just separate us in our relationships. Sin separates us from God, and that's the bottom line. We all go, yeah, I know that. You're not telling me anything I don't know. I know we know that, but we don't always understand it. Let's delve into it. See, sin has that same effect on our relationship as it did that woman and that man. Isaiah, if we were to ask Isaiah what his thoughts are, Isaiah would say this over in Isaiah 59, verse number 2. He would say this, but your iniquities, speaking to Israel, he says, but your iniquities have separated you from your God. And yet we go around smiling like, I'm good, you're good, we're all good because we're good people. No. Our sin has separated us from our God. You know, when we talk about death, in the biblical sense, if you didn't know this, death is separation. That's the biblical definition of death. And Paul, the very same guy over the last couple of weeks that I've spoken, we've talked about how he said that nothing can separate us from the love of God, and we gave that long list in Romans chapter 8. Paul says this in Romans chapter 6, verse 23, a very familiar verse. He says, for the wages of sin is separation from God, death. The wages of sin, and we're all like, yeah, these unsaved heathen. No. Let's not apply it to somebody else. Let's go back to the question, can a person like you be in the place where God is? See, sin separates us. But when I read those, be honest with you, you probably a lot like me. I didn't do anything bad. And we got to ask that little question in the back of our mind. It's going like, come on. Are you saying that all sin separates me? All sins make me horrible? See, is Isaiah and Paul really saying that anyone who doesn't live a sinless, perfect life is separated from God? Absolutely, because it only takes one sin to separate. If you don't believe me, and I wouldn't try this, but find a relationship and just go ahead, commit that one sin, you'll see how quickly it separates. See, it's one sin that destroy a marriage. It's one sin that destroys a husband and wife's relationship together. It's one sin that destroys the child and parent relationship. It's one sin that separated siblings. I already gave you the story of Cain and Abel real quick. It's one sin that separates us from God. And everyone says, God, hey, you know what? I'm nice. I didn't commit murder. I didn't rape anybody. I didn't do anything bad. You've got to be okay with me because I didn't do anything horrible. And that's why it's so hard, especially for those, and Tracy and I talked about this not too long ago. I think the hardest group to reach sometimes are the kids who grew up in church all their lives. I was one of those kids. You know why? I was a sinner, but I had a hard time reconciling the fact that I was. Because I didn't do anything really bad. But it isn't that. See, it's this one sin that separates us from God. Because sin is the separator. In one of the Bible's most humbling descriptions of sin, Paul says this over in Romans chapter 1, just two verses because there's so much there. But Romans chapter 1, verses 21 and 25, this is what Paul said. He said, for although he's speaking of mankind in whole, he's giving a critique of the problem of mankind's sinful nature. He says, for though they knew God, wouldn't that be something we'd say of not heathen people, but Christ followers? Although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God, nor gave thanks to him. But in their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Verse 25, they exchanged the truth about God for a lie. That sounds like a poor exchange. And worshiped and served created things more than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. They raised the this above the God who made the this. And that's what those people back in Psalm that we read, better is one day with God than 1,000 elsewhere, right? That's what they understood. See, Paul here points out two truths that we don't always get when we read that, because we're always thinking about the poor heathen that are out murdering people or out raping people, but he's not really talking about them. He's talking about us. He was talking about himself. And when we look at this in Romans chapter 1, what Paul says here is the heart of sin is a refusal to glorify God as capital G, capital O, capital D. An absurd claim that God is not a big deal. And that's been one of our biggest problems about getting in the presence of God. It's not a big deal to miss church, right? It's just God. I used to, when people, I've always been a smart mouth. I know it's hard to believe that. But when I was working on staff down in Florida, people would always give me, like, I'm not coming to church today or whatever. And I go, I don't care. God probably doesn't mind either. He's probably okay with you skipping out on him. You know, I mean, he's only done everything for you. I know you're not supposed to say that. It wasn't very loving. I was wrong. I know that. But that's what I was thinking. Sometimes you didn't say what you're thinking. But that's the problem. See, it's not a big deal to skip out on God. It's not a big deal to not come to church. It's not a big deal not to read my Bible. It's not a big deal to pray. It's not a big deal to give. It's not a big deal to do any of those things, is it? Not when you don't think much of God. And that's the problem Paul presents here. The other thing he says is that sin, if you read through this, sin silences praise and saves its worship for the things of this world. Uh-oh. That's why we think the beach in Hawaii is better than 1 day with God. Ooh. The psalmist had it right, didn't they? But I have a hard time reconciling that. Why? Sin. Because sin separated me from God. Sin says, make more of my relationship with my vacation and my externals than with the God who saved me, that we just sang about, that Jesus paid it all. All to him I owe. Yeah, this is going to be a hard one today, isn't it? It's tough, because that's the truth. See, here's the truth. You will never know how serious your sin is until you understand and grasp the glory of God. That's what Paul would want us to know. You never understand that. We can cry about nice tunes and stuff like that as we sing worship songs, but the truth of the matter is you still don't get it until you grasp the glory of God. And the reason why those guys wrote the Psalms is because they understood who God was at least a little bit. That's why Isaiah wrote, hey, you know what? The same people who wrote those Psalms, he says, your sins have separated from your God. That's why Paul could look at it and say, the wages of your sin, that payment, what you owe is death, eternal separation. And it takes us to the text I really want to be to. If you have your Bibles, turn to the book of Luke. Luke chapter 15 is where we're going to be. 3 stories Jesus tells in this. 3 parables. Now, that's a fancy word for an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. That's the easy one that I learned back when I was in Sunday school. But these are stories that brought about divine truth. And every one of them, every parable story that Jesus told had one subject that he taught, the grace of God. Every one of them centered on that. Now, they did it in different ways, but every one of them, that's the center target. And so, as we look at this, there are 3 stories in this. There's a lost sheep, a lost coin, and then a lost son. Sometimes it's referred to as the prodigal son. I don't like that title very well. It's not a very good title because it deals with, the word prodigal is not a term we use a lot unless you're in accounting, finance. That is a financial term. It does not mean sinful. It means I'm poor with my money, poor with my stuff. So he had problems with his prodigality, or so he went through his stuff. That's the whole idea. It's a pretty familiar story, even to people who haven't been around, but we're not going to take time to read the whole thing. But what we have sometimes done is we've skipped over the whole story in order just to focus on the younger son. And we want to look at, because really the focus of the story is not either one of the sons, it's actually the father. And that's where most of us get it wrong. We talk about the story of this younger brother and this older brother, and the moral of the story is easy to miss unless you're thinking about one thing, the presence of God. And that really is the theme that you need to keep in mind as we read through this. So Luke chapter 15, and we're going to start off by talking about the younger brother. You understand, as Jesus tells the story, he had everybody on pins and needles because you have this young man coming to his father and saying things that he would get stoned for in their culture. And we pick up in verses number 12 and 13, this young man, as Jesus tells the story, says, the younger one, this young man, said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." Now, I don't know, we're in a different culture now, so it doesn't make as much sense. Inheritances in our 21st century don't really go very far, but it was their whole world back then. And the oldest always got the lion's share, got the most, inherited more of it, but everybody got something, including a blessing, and that was very important in their culture. And yet you had to be patient enough to wait for your turn to get it, and it came at the deathbed was the blessing, and then after the death, obviously, was when you got the inheritance. And this young man comes to his dad, who's still capable of running the house, and says, "Dad, I want what I want, give it to me now." And that's really, we're shocked, or we should be shocked at the way the son is talking to his dad. Basically saying, "Dad, I wish you were dead. You're nothing to me. You would be better to me if you were dead, so please give me what you would give me if you were dead." So he divided, this is what the father does, so he divided his property between them. Now, maybe you missed that, reading it too fast sometimes, but he divided it between them. Once again, we have a tendency to look down on this younger brother so often, but both boys are involved here. Both of them got something out of this. Older brother profited too, okay? Verse 13, not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there he squandered his wealth with wild living. Now, that's a nice way to put it. Wild living basically is the G-rated version of something that would make us all blush if we actually told the truth. He went and hung out with pigs and prostitutes is what the simpler version would be. Now, pigs came later than prostitutes, but he ended up blowing everything he had, which wasn't really his, it was his dad's. He squandered it, which could be another lesson we could learn, but he finds himself living in a pig sty. He lives in the pig pen with the pigs, and to us, we're like, well, that's gross. That's more than gross because these are Israelites that he's talking to, and they are not supposed to touch, they are not supposed to eat, they are not supposed to have any kind of interaction with pigs. They are considered unclean, both religiously and in their day-to-day life too. They never tasted bacon, or they didn't get any kind of barbecue or anything like that. That's just how it was. They must have been, I think Jews are part Texan because they only ate beef, you know what I'm saying? And that's tragedy if you don't have bacon in your life. So maybe that's why sometimes they were always upset about things and complaining to Moses, but that's just my theory. You guys don't seem like you're in a good mood today or something like that. It's okay to smile in church. But anyway, he ends up in this bad situation, and you have to see the crowd is just so shocked that this young man would end up being with pigs, and not only is he living with pigs, feeding pigs, but he's so hungry now because he's starving that he is thinking about eating what they eat. And what do pigs eat? Slop. Yeah, that's the nice word for it. Things I ain't eating. Garbage would look better sometimes than what they eat because they don't discriminate, do they? This is gross. And they're just dirty animals. They really are. And so what we see here is the son, and I want to make this point, the son goes to a far country. He separates himself from the father. Basically what he's saying is, Dad, being with you isn't enough. I need more than you to make me happy. That's what you can gather out of that. Remember, we're dealing with the issue of presence of God. God is represented by the Father, in case you didn't know that in the story. And basically the son says, I want what I want because you aren't enough. And wow, we're sitting back going, wow, I know people like that. They are bad people. They don't go to church. They're always, they're just bad people. Yeah, sure. But what about the other brother? I'm glad you asked. The older brother. Let's skip down to verse 28. So the younger son, let me cut the chase. The younger son, after going through all the bad stuff, comes to his senses and says, you know what? The servants of my father are better than I am. I'm just going to tell Dad I blew it. I know I don't have a relationship with you anymore, but please, if you're hiring, could you hire me? I'm willing just to be a slave. And so he makes this plan, and he starts heading back. Filth of the pig pen on him. I mean, the smells. I remember when I was living, when I was going to college, I used to have to drive back to the Outer Banks, and it took me through Smithfield, Virginia. Anybody know what's in Smithfield, Virginia? That is where they grow the best country hams. I'm just telling you, but you get behind some of these hog trucks. It's bad enough to get behind chicken trucks around here, but those hog trucks, I mean, it's not just you got to turn the air conditioning off and close the windows, but you got to not get too close or you're going to have it on your car. And it's gross. And that's what was all over this boy. He didn't have, there wasn't a change of clothes. He's poor. He's starving. He doesn't have change of clothes anymore. He's been living with pigs. He's got the filth of the pigs all over him, the smell of the pigs all over him. He's no right-minded Jew would ever want him. And yet he's going to try and beg for a job, and yet we find his father's waiting for him. And he does something so unusual, he runs to him. Shows once again the grace of the father, because the father wanted him more than the son wanted the father. He says, hey, get a robe for him. Put one of my robes on. Put my ring on his finger and go out and kill the fatted calf because we're partying like it's 1999. I don't know why that's even a saying. I didn't party when it was 1999. But anyway. I do that to myself, don't I? So there's this big party going on, and I mean, this fatted calf, there's an assumption here. Now, we're used to going to our stores and like somebody kill something for us so we can have our steaks and whatever. In those kind of areas, that kind of world, you would grow it till its old age and then kill it because you probably only had one good one. And so this is the fatted calf. I don't know where they must have had it for a long time because everybody talks about it being the fatted calf. There's no doubt about it. So they're partying. They've killed this fatted calf, invited all of his friends and everybody, and they're celebrating. And so we pick up the story. Verse number 28 says, the older brother became angry and refused to go in. Okay, so he's out in the field working, and he hears the noise of a party, and he looks at one of the servants, and he says, what in the world's going on? And the servant says, hey, you remember that brother of yours, that knucklehead brother, the younger one who went off and we never thought we'd see him again? He's back. Yeah. And your dad, he killed the fatted calf, and he's throwing this huge party, and he's wearing Dad's ring. He's wearing Dad's robe. He's eating. All of his friends are here, and I'm supposed to come get you. And older brother, that doesn't sit well with him. He's angry. Who's he angry at? He's not angry at the brother. He's angry at the father. Watch how it plays out. So older brother became angry and refused to go in. Why would he refuse to go in? It's not about the brother. He's refused to go into the presence of his dad. By the way, the older brother is the religious side of things here. It's going to represent us. So his father went out. Now, we always talk about the father running to the younger son, but this is just as important. He went out, left the party. He's throwing the party. He would never leave the party, but he does. He went out and he pleaded with him. He pleaded with him. He didn't say, I'm going to get a 2x4 and knock some sense in that kid. No, he says, I'm going to plead with you. I'm going to beg you. He didn't have to. He was still in a position of authority, but he begs him. But he answered. This is what he says. He answered his father, look. And once again, you see that speech is just not right for a child to be talking to his father. I don't care what age he is. He says, look, all these years I've been slaving for you, liar. You haven't been slaving for him. You've been slaving for yourself. But he says, I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed. I find that hard to be. Anybody that's got kids would be like, I don't believe this story at all. Okay? Never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me. Boom, there it is. You never gave me. You know what he's saying? You are not enough for me. You are not enough for me. Isn't that what his younger brother said? Absolutely. The older brother's saying the same thing. You are not enough for me, Dad. I worked, did all this stuff for you, and I was thinking I'm going to get more than you. Says, you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, not my brother, with this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, boom, he's hitting hard now, comes home, you killed the fatted calf for him. Notice it's the fatted calf, once again. And this is what the father says, verse 31. My son, the father said, you are always with me. Wow. You are always with me, and everything I have is yours. What did the father say? You are always with me. Why does he have to tell him that? Because the son had forgotten what's important, the presence of the Father. Hey, in the middle of all of our serving of God, you know what we do sometimes? We forget that God is always with us. And that's what the Father's trying to say. You got the same problem as your younger brother. I wasn't enough for him, and you don't think I'm enough for you either. You think that a goat or a calf is going to make life better. In our terms, what would we say? You think a better bank account, a better job, a better recreation, a better vacation, a better whatever vehicle, better house, better relationship. Remember all the temporary things we've been talking about? That's what we think is better, and that's not what is better. Better is one day in the court with God than 1,000 of this. It's the same problem once again. Jesus is pointing it out. See, we all have the same spiritual struggle. We are not content with God. His presence doesn't satisfy us anymore. We either rebel and run off as reckless living like the younger brother, or we get really religious and we grudgingly obey, but we're stewing secretly about young calves that we think we should get in our lives. Both of these lifestyles are supremely offensive to the Father. That's the point we should understand. Because both of these lifestyles, whether the younger or older brother, they both imply that God is not enough to make us happy. He's not enough to satisfy us. That Jesus paid it all, to him I owe, doesn't really mean anything. It's just a song we sing. Because then we complain about not having enough money to pay the bills, not having better health, not having enough relationships, not having more of anything that's temporary, when God is all we need. That's the truth. The problem is, and this is why we have a problem with this, we don't identify with these brothers, even though I pointed out how we do identify with them, because we don't see ourselves as either rebellious or ungrateful. But here's what I want you to understand, that even the good people, and I use quotation marks if you would around that, the good people of God's word, they still weren't enough, and they discovered the truth that God, sometimes they can't be in his presence. Remember the question we start off with? Can a person like you, a person like me, be in the place where God is? Isaiah chapter 6, verse 5. This is what Isaiah said when he's in the presence of God. He says, "Woe is me, I cried. I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. And my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." You get what Isaiah is saying here? He says, hey, I've seen God. I had a vision of God in his temple. And what I realized is I can't stand in the same place because I'm filthy. It's like I got pig slop all over me. Luke, in case you thought that was an Old Testament and the Old Testament doesn't apply, Luke chapter 5, verse 8. Listen, Peter's been out fishing. He's a professional fisherman. He knows more about fishing than most people. And yet he hasn't caught anything. Jesus comes along, this itinerant preacher, this rabbi, and says, hey, Peter, just throw your net on the other side one time for me, and you're going to see something. And he does, and he gets a huge, huge, huge catch, more than he can really bring in. And Peter falls down. This is what Peter says in Luke chapter 5, verse 8. It says, when Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man. Can a person like Peter be in the same place where God is? Evidently, Peter didn't think so, did he? John, Jesus' best friend while he was here on earth in ministry, the one who leaned on Jesus and was closer than anybody, he sees the glorified Jesus in the revelation that he writes down in the last book of the Bible. In Revelation 1:17, he makes a statement. He says, when John saw him, that is Jesus, I fell at his feet as though dead. Remember what death represents? Separation from God. See, any mistaken belief that you are good enough will disappear when you actually see who God is. And that's the truth. See, the truth of the matter is, so often we think we're good enough because we don't see God for who he is. And that's where it is. Let me give you 2 quick definitions that we really need to understand. And I've alluded to these before. The definition for heaven, for maybe some people that don't know or they don't believe in a place, first of all, I want to say both these places are literally real places. They do exist. But number one, we have heaven. And heaven, according to the biblical definition, heaven would be the place where God is here and in the fullness of his love and glory. That's what we see over and over again. See, so often we get caught up in Christianity talking about streets of gold and jewels and all the other stuff, the trappings of the location. But really, heaven is where God is here in all of his love and glory. Which means I've got a definition for the other place, hell. What is hell? Hell is where God isn't here at all. That's the simple definition there. Hell is the exact opposite. It's absence. And the essence of hell is the absence of God and his presence. And if you say, well, that's I don't believe you. Matthew chapter 25, Jesus is speaking here. Matthew chapter 25, verse 41. He's talking about the judgment at the end of time when God's separating sinners and saints. And he says here, then he will say to those on his left, that is God, depart from me. Get out of my presence. Depart from me, you who are cursed, into eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. What is hell? Depart from me. Get out of my presence. See, hell is only dark because God is absent, and God is the light of the universe. Hell is what we feel when God is completely gone in our lives. There is no this in hell, and I don't care what the old rock bands used to say that I'm going to be glad to go there and party with all my friends. You're not going to a party because this is not in hell. It's not. You know the old saying that the atheists will say, I'd rather rule in hell than serve in heaven. Oh, you're not ruling anywhere in hell. There's nothing but torment. That's the problem with it. That's why when Jesus talks about the importance of life, he makes this statement over in Mark chapter 8, verse 36. And think about this in connection with what we said about 1,000 days elsewhere and 1 day in God's presence. Jesus said it this way. He said, what good is it if someone gains the whole world yet forfeits their soul? Ooh, those are some pretty harsh words there. See, God, and this is what we have a struggle with, God has to take your sin and my sin seriously. He can't just go, hey, you're a pretty good person. You didn't do anything horribly bad. You didn't rape anybody. You didn't murder anybody. You didn't steal anything huge. Just little petty sins is okay. Well, that's not good. Because the question I would ask is, what would a person like me, what would a person like you do to heaven? You ever thought about that one? If God let you in as is, what would a person like you, what would a person like me do to heaven? What we would do is a person like me would make heaven not so good. That's the problem. In Revelation, John writes this, Revelation chapter 22, verse 14 and 15. He's talking about this heaven, and he makes this statement. He says, blessed are those who, and he goes on to say a few things, but he comes back to it. He says, blessed are those who go through the gates into the city. He's talking about the New Jerusalem, the heaven, right? But he also says this. He said, outside are the dogs who practice magic arts, the sexually immoral, the murderers. And I'm sitting here as I'm reading it going, yeah, didn't do that one, didn't do that one, didn't do that one. He goes on, he says, the idolaters, okay, he might get me there if I'm honest, but I really don't think I'm an idolater either, but probably am. But then he makes this statement. And everyone, hate that statement. And everyone who loves and practices falsehood. Loves and practices falsehood. Everyone who isn't living by the truth. Remember John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, the life. Everyone who's not living the Jesus life 100% all the time. Because that's me. That's probably you too. Everyone who isn't washed and clean and holy cannot walk in the presence of God. That's what he's saying there. This is no hope here. But this is the whole reason why we need someone to wash us, to cleanse us. This is why we need Jesus. Because if you didn't know this, Jesus was a real person. I know today they want to make him into a fairy tale and a non-existent person, but Jesus lived. He lived here on this earth. God came down in flesh and lived for 33 and a half years. 3.5 of those years he lived in ministry, where he was God in the flesh doing the greatest this of all times. That's where we see him feeding people, healing people, doing amazing things, because God was pointing out that he is more this than any this ever could be, right? That's what all those miracles were all about. He's bringing people back from the dead. That's this. He was feeding people. He was healing the blind. He was relieving people's burdens. He was casting out demons. He was building God's kingdom, showing them what this was. And then he died, because Jesus also had to experience some of that. Remember that? We don't like that. In agony, Jesus on the cross cries out the most miserable of all statements when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? You know what he's saying there? I'm separated. Sin was first cast upon Jesus, and it wasn't his sin. That's why it was so hard. It was my sin. It was your sin. But we don't stop there with that. The truth of the matter is, Jesus didn't just live and die, but he rose. And without that, that's the whole source of our hope. See, the truth today, and here it is. I want to give you that one truth. Because God separated death from Jesus, life with God can never be separated from us. That's the bottom line. Because God separated death from Jesus. See, Jesus came, he lived, and he died, but he didn't stay dead. He beat death. That's why Easter is the most important day. These historical writings, they just reveal the facts of witnesses, eyewitnesses of the event that we celebrate every year at Easter, of the event that gives us the name Christians, because we don't follow writings, we follow a risen Lord. That's what the resurrection is all about. That's the hope that's within us. And you know what he did when he beat death? What do we say death was? Separation. He says, there's no longer a need to be separated from me. Those days that you thought 1,000 days elsewhere were better, they aren't. You can be in the presence of God. Remember the question I started off with? Can a person like you, a person like me, be in the place where God is? Only because of Jesus Christ. Mark chapter 15, just one little quick passage I want to point out. Maybe you've never noticed this before. Mark 15, 37 and 38. Mark, writing quickly, he gives the briefest of all the gospel accounts, but Mark says this, talking about the death of Jesus Christ. He says, with a loud cry. Jesus hanging on the cross. He says, with a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. It's over. He's dead. And then he makes this statement that I think we've read and we sort of understand, but we just sort of skip over. But it's amazing here. He says, the curtain of the temple was torn into from top to bottom. Now to you, you're like, okay, so get it. I sort of get it. It means something theological. We get into the holy holies. Yeah. It means a little bit more than that. See, the temple curtain was a silent sermon that preached one thought, that God is here and you have to be out there. That was the message of the temple curtain. If you didn't know, that temple curtain kept people out of the holy place where God was. It was a separator. Separated men from God. But if we read that passage right, what did it say? The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Make no mistake about it. Not bottom to top, but top to bottom. This curtain was several stories high and several feet thick. It could not be ripped by mere earthquakes or even by mortal men. It was the hand of God reached down and said, you know what? What Jesus has done, I'm opening my presence to you. And that simple verse that we skip over so often preaches the story of what Christ did for us. See, from top to bottom, God ripped apart the reasons for your and my separation from him. And so the greatest place we can be is here with God.